stream.
And welcome to the people that have joined so far. We're just waiting a few minutes to see if there are more people who are going to join before we start the webinar formally. Please let me know in chat if anyone's having any problems with the sound, and if people can't hear, or if there are any problems with the stream. Okay, so we're still getting people coming in, but we're 1 minute past. So I think if no one has any problems hearing what we're talking about, I'm going to start the webinar. My name is Simon Weldon, and together with Fahmuddin and Agus, we represent the Peatland group of the Global Research Alliance Croplands Group. The Global Research Alliance Group focuses on greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and efforts to mitigate these emissions. It's an international group, so we have participants from all over the world, from all backgrounds. And we're hoping in the long run, if anybody is interested in joining the GRA, or especially joining the Peatlands group, would please take contact with either myself or the GRA Secretariat, and we will put you on our mailing lists. The first thing I want to do today is to thank our two presenters. The first we're going to introduce is Dr. Fahmuddin Agus, who's a senior scientist from the National Agency for Research and Innovation in Indonesia. His recent work focuses on peatland management, adaptation and mitigation of agriculture to climate change, and overcoming the yield gaps of rice, maize, and oil palm. He was a member of the 6th Assessment Report of the Task Force on the National Greenhouse Gas Inventories of the IPCC. If anybody's got any questions during the or come up with any questions during the presentation, we have a Q&A section. So if anyone puts any questions in there, at the end of the session, we'll ask Dr. Fahmuddin to answer those questions. It's also possible for us to read the chat. So without any further ado, I pass over to Dr. Fahmuddin Agus.
Thank you very much, Simon. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who is attending this seminar. Thank you for attending. So the topic I'm going to present this evening for Indonesian time.
Sorry to interrupt. Okay.
Yeah, will be the net greenhouse gas balance from several land cover types in Indonesian peatland. The reason we are doing this kind of analysis because there are quite a few methods of assessing greenhouse gas emission from peatland. One of the most common method is closed chamber because of its simplicity and its ability to cover different land cover types and different points, and also the subsidence method. What is measured by the closed chamber is the CO2 from microbial respiration or from peat decomposition, and it also measures the autotrophic or root respiration. In practice, we are minimizing this component because at the end of the day, what we really want to assess is the emission from peat decomposition. And the subsidence is indirectly assessing the peat decomposition emission or microbial respiration by assessing the decomposition and subsidence ratio. While the AD covariance technique measure the net ecosystem exchange. So it covers the microbial respiration, the autotrophic respiration, and also the removal from photosynthesis. So what you get here is the net CO2. What really matters for climate change is the net CO2 because this really reflects the contribution of CO2 coming into the atmosphere. This is the distribution of the covariance tower around the world. So what you see here is mostly in the North America and in Europe, while in Southeast Asia, where peatland is important, it's only about 15 covariance tower. This presentation is about Desmos paper that was recently published in Nature journal, and also this is on the acacia plantation and forest peatland, while the Kulongono experiment is on oil palm plantation. And in the Desmos paper, there is also the relationship of water table and CO2 emission. And these are very important for tier 3 peat emission factor, and also as the basis for developing emission reduction strategies. So the paper from Desmos was based on research in Kampar Peninsula, the eastern part of Sumatra, central Sumatra, from 3 different land use systems: pits from forest, degraded pits from forest, and acacia plantation. So the duration of the measurement is about 5 years. What was measured was the CO2 and methane. This research also had N2O measurement from cross chamber. So this is how the acacia plantation looks like, and this is the close to intact pits from forest, and this is the degraded pits from forest. And the frequency of the measurement is every 30 minutes, and the coverage area is around 200 hectares. While the oil palm plantation measurement is also in Riau, and it's an ongoing study. And the measurement that is summarized here is based on 4 years observation. This is the results of the acacia and degraded site and the intact site. So for the acacia, surprisingly, the measured emission, the net ecosystem exchange emission is very low. It's only about 9.5 tons CO2 per hectare per year. And this paper includes the export of CO2 from the harvested wood, assuming that the harvested wood component will be emitted about 1 or 2 years after the harvest. Although in IPCC, this is taken care of from the carbon stock exchange in the biomass. And there are also the fluvial sea export, methane, and soil N2O. All of these are in CO2 equivalent. And in the degraded side, the emission, the NEE component is very high. It's about 41 tons per hectare per year. Well, in the intake, in what's intake, it's about 15 tons per hectare per year. So when we conserve the intake forest from conversion into the degraded forest, what we save is about 26 tons of CO2 per hectare per year. And on the other hand, when we do not convert intake site, which is illegal anyway, to the acacia plantation, what we save is about 18 tons of CO2 per hectare per year. And however, converting the degraded site into acacia plantation would reduce about 7.5 tons of CO2 per hectare per year. So this is the main message from here. Why does it happen like so? When we see this cumulative net CO2 emission from acacia plantation at the beginning of the growth, the first year, the cumulative emission is always increasing, meaning that the NEE is positive. But there are times when the slope here is negative. This means that the NEE is negative. And at the end of the 5 years plantation, this is the amount of biomass which is emitted from harvest. For the degraded side, the amount of emission is high, and we don't see the we don't see the negative slope, meaning that it's always positive NEE. For the intake forest, there are some event with the negative NEE. However, here the photosynthetic absorption or CO2 removal is very high in the acacia. So again, during the planting, plus the planting period, the emission is high, and during the growth, the photosynthetic removal is high, and there is the harvested wood release of CO2 about 20.5 tons per hectare per year if it is average. And the IPCC default value was 73 tons per hectare per year for Acacia crassicarpa plantation. This is from Pulongono data. What we see here is that the daytime emission is negative, and the nighttime is positive. This is because, again, because of the photosynthesis. And if we compare several NEE results for this is in Malaysia by McCalman. In the beginning, this is the oil palm, young oil palm plantation has a very high rate of emission. But when the age of the oil palm increases, the emission decreases. Except for this Q paper, where the emission is close to the default value of the PCC. And in the Pulongono, it's about the same as the McCalman of the mature oil palm plantation. And the peat swamp forest, if we compare with other research in the Hirano paper, is about 6. And so the paper of Desmos has about twice as high emission from what we call intact forest. In the degraded forest, the value is much higher for Desmos paper than the others. So if we draw the curve of the McCalman paper, this reflects our function. And if we take the average of the one oil palm cycle up to 25 years, the average is 35 tons of CO2 per year. Well, in Q, it's about the same, and in Kulongono, for this plant age, it's very comparable to common paper. So again, if we compare with the emission factor, keep in mind that the default emission factor of the PCC has a wide 95% confidential interval. And the second result is the relationship of water table with the MEE. So if we compare it with the older paper based on the cross chamber measurement, the slope is much higher. The slope here is about 0.9, meaning that for every centimeter of increase in water table, there is about 0.9 tons decrease in CO2 emission. In the Desmos paper, combined with the other paper in the Tropics, the curve shows like this. The CO2 flux is minus 0.64 times groundwater level, meaning that every increase of 1 centimeter water table will decrease the emission of 0.65 tons of CO2 per hectare per year. Well, in the Hirano paper, as a comparison, it has a wide range, and the range is about 0.3 to 0.9 increase in the emission of CO2 for every centimeter decrease in groundwater level. So the main message is that the relationship here is very much about 80% is explained by water table, while the rest is explained by other factors. And Hirano also mentioned that the main factor for the relationship is the water table. So the main ways to raise water table is canal blocking, culture, and planting by water table tolerant species. And there are many construction of canal blocks. And so there is a challenge in the in defining the activity data. And the paper of Sutikno says that if we can raise water table in the canal of about 0.7 meter, we can expect about 0.3 meter increase in the water table in the radius of 60 meter, and about 0.2 meter in the radius of 210 10 meters. And this is very useful in order to really assess the effectiveness of the canal blocks and the intensity, the density of the canal blocking, and also the quality of the canal blocking will determine how effective, how good is the activity data. So the implication of this presentation is that there are opportunities to use ecovariance based on emission factors for higher tier for several land uses, including oil palm plantation, forest plantation, and acacia plantation. The groundwater level is the dominant factor in determining the net ecosystem exchange, and hence managing water table to a level as high as the crop can tolerate is an important strategy for emission reduction. And there is still, I believe, a need for evaluating the effectiveness of canal blocks, how large an area is affected, and how high the groundwater level can be increased because of variation in the construction and the properties of it. And probably not very much related with the peatland working group is the development of high water table tolerant species will be important, and also the polyculture system. So these are the references that you can click if you're interested. And that's all for my presentation. Thank you very much. And back to Simon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fahmuddin. That was a really interesting presentation. Thank you. I noticed that there are actually 2 questions that are currently in the question and answer session. We have some time for answering these questions if you're okay, and I can read the first question from Mulnir Takriti. His question was, I'm not sure if I missed it, but when was the acacia plantation established? When was the site originally converted for agriculture?
Yeah, so I would like to say that this is probably the second cycle. So it was established from degraded forests. So 2 or 3 cycle means one cycle is 5 years, and there would be about 6 to 12 months transition from one cycle to the other. I guess I didn't answer the question.
If anybody has any follow-up questions, please put them in the question and answer, and we can follow up. We have another question from Elizabeth Beltran. Where do emissions from the intact site come from? Do I interpret correctly that the chart showed the emissions from acacia plantation towards the end of rotation are lower than emissions from the intact peat swamp forest? Thank you.
Yeah, we had a long discussion about the intact forest and the historical land cover and land management data. The historical image shows that the intact forest is not quite intact forest anymore. So it has been affected by drainage. It has been cut for some time in the past. Yes, towards the end of the cycle, the acacia plantation emission is lower because the growth factor is very high in the acacia. It means the removal through photosynthesis is high, and in fact the negative slope, the declining trend shows that during the period the net ecosystem exchange was negative. So what the CO2 that goes up, passing the sensor, was smaller than the removal from photosynthesis.
Thank you. We have some more questions. We have a question from Marvin Gabriel. What is the explanation for the undisturbed site being a greenhouse gas source and not a sink?
Yeah, I think I answered the question before, that the understood. Yeah, it is not quite the same. So even if as the at the full maturity of the forest, the growth is not that much, and what come to the ground surface as the litter will also decompose. So it is far different from what we observe in the acacia plantation.
We also have a question from Stefan Weissner. Have you considered the global warming potential of methane?
Yeah, because all of the data that we presented were on the CO2 equivalent. So the global warming potential has been taken care of.
We also have a question from Kamil Sada. What are degraded peat swamp forests in your study? If I understand correctly, these are drained swamp forests.
Yes, it is drained. Yeah, it's not only it is drained, and it may have been some part may have been affected by fire, but I'm not sure. But for sure, it is affected by drainage.
Okay, so if we have no more open questions, I just want to say thank you very much, Dr. Agus, for a very nice presentation and some very interesting work. And I will open the floor to Junbin Zhao. So Junbin is a researcher at the same institute as me at the Norwegian Institute of Bioeconomy Research. He has a PhD in ecology, and his work has been focused on ecosystem processes underlying carbon, water, and energy balance, particularly in response to climate change and land management. Over the past 10 years, he has conducted research at various boreal and subtropical wetland locations, and he is now coordinating a Norwegian Research Council-funded project that investigates management in peatland cultivation and its greenhouse gas potentials in Norway. And I'll pass the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. And I'll try to share my screen now. Hope it works. And I hope what you see on my screen is the presentation mode, right? Okay, so I will start my talk. And thanks everyone for participating in this webinar. I think it's quite a great opportunity and a pleasure for me to give a talk here and share some of the results we got recently about peatland greenhouse gas observations. And I also include an example from Northern Norway as a observation study. And also this kind of study cannot be completed with one person. So I have a lot of collaborators, a lot of amazing colleagues who have contributed a lot to the results, to like field work and data analysis, everything, experiment design. So I'm very thankful for those contributions. And as already introduced a little bit by Dr. Agus, and peatland is a type of wetland, and what we are are very interested in peatland because it is a big carbon stock, and it's account for a third of the global soil carbon. And the reason behind that is it's been mostly flooded with water, and so it creates an environment that is not very friendly to decomposition of carbon. So there are a lot of dead biomass accumulated there over years and start to become this what we call peat. And so it depends on the location of the peatland. There are different types of peatland. And if we look at the distribution of the peatland, it's mostly distributed along the boreal areas across the globe, because those are most favorable climate for peat accumulations, wet and cold. But we can also see a lot of peatland also distributed in the subtropical and tropical areas, and especially in Indonesia, Africa, and some of the South America countries. And right now, the biggest problem we have now is that peatlands are largely trained for a lot of different uses. And I think this is a quite reasonable practice. If you think of the peatland is flooded, and most of the time it's not very usable for human beings. But once we want to make use of the peatlands, the first thing to do is to drain the peatland so we can grow plants, for example, on that. And but recently, and because of the climate change, is getting more and more attention, and we just start to find that this drained peatland is actually a hotspot for CO2 emissions. And so for this kind of CO2 emissions, and people are thinking about ways to restore those peatland in order to reserve those carbon still inside of the peatland. That is why restoration becomes a very hot topic recently, that a lot of countries are adapting different approaches and strategies to do restoration on peatland to cut the emission from there. And the most straightforward approach would be to re-wet the peatland. And once it's been re-wetted and introduced the water, and the environment and toxic environment is coming back, then the carbon is somehow considered as saved in the peatland. And furthermore, people are thinking about to further make use of the peatland. So culture, which make growing energy crops, for example, on peatland, re-wetted peatland, are also an idea that has been tested in many places. But I think most importantly, because these restoration plans are very region specific, so there has to be a lot of observations for greenhouse gases from those peatland, and to compare the drained peatland with the restored peatland. So, and this year, we have carried out a literature review, and to look at how many studies have been carried out across the globe on greenhouse gas emissions from peatland, and in order to identify some of the observation gaps that we can focus on in the future. And we can see from this graph that the number of studies on greenhouse gas emissions from peatland are increasing sharply across the last 2 decades, and which is good news that that it indicates peatland has been paying more and more attention here. And as to the flux measurements, as already mentioned by Dr. Agus, that this very straightforward way to do the measurements will be use those chambers. And what we do for chambers is to cover the land that are interested to us with this chamber, and we measure the greenhouse gas goes into that and what comes out and compare those two. Those are then we will be able to estimate what is happening there. So that is a flux inside the chamber. So the advantage of this method is that it's very relatively cheap. What you need is an analyzer and then some chamber, and it's very portable. You can carry it out anywhere you want to do the measurements, and especially in some remote areas. This is a very practical approach. And I think the most important point for chamber measurement is that it's targeted on the plot level. So it has a very controllable footprint area, and you know where you're measuring. And so that can facilitate a lot of this manipulative experiment designs. And yeah, but at the same time, those chambers, we can see a lot of cons as well, because their limited footprint area, and they can have a very low spatial coverage. At the same time, we have to, most of the measurements are carried out manually, so the temporal resolution is relatively low. And to cover some of the shortcomings from chambers, and we have this eddy currents eddy currents method, which make use some of the theories from micrometeorology. And the basic idea is to measure the wind, where does it blow, and at the same time measures the greenhouse gas concentration in the air. So you can see how much of the air has been brought out of the ecosystem, and how much has been brought in. So this method has a lot of advantages over the chambers. The first thing is it's at the ecosystem scale, so it can cover a large areas. Usually in the peatland, if we have 3-meter tall mast, it can cover 100 meters in radius around the tower, and very good spatial representative for the measurements. At the same time, it measures at usually 20 to 10 hertz or 20 hertz. So it measures do the measurements every 10 times or 20 times every second. So it has a very good temporal coverage. And also it has a lot of global network support, as already showed by Dr. Agus. The coverage is quite big across the globe. But the biggest disadvantage for this method is very costly, and a lot of the projects don't have the financial support to buy this kind of a system. So that makes the availability of this system a little bit limited. So talking about these methods, we also look at the method they use in the literatures, and we can see most of the studies nowadays, they are still using chambers, and the eddy currents measurements only account from a quarter to a fifth of those measurements, especially for the N2O measurements. And the majority of them are chambers, and eddy currents measurements are still very rare, simply because the analyzer itself is very expensive, and there are still a lot of technical problems with measuring N2O emissions. So there are still some way to go for eddy currents. But at the same time, for chamber measurements for N2O, as we know, N2O fluxes are mostly very sporadic, or it's a very episodic. It doesn't happen all the time. A lot of budgets, according to some studies, are mainly contributed by this hot moment and hot spots. So those chamber measurements, they are somehow has some limitation to represent the entire flux patterns. And so speaking of these chambers, still the dominant methods for doing these flux measurements. And we think it's important to evaluate the chamber data to see how representative they can be for the entire fluxes. And those data are mostly used for modeling purposes or to calculate the budget from the ecosystem that they have a good quality. And the first thing we checked is the season coverage. So we see most of the studies, they have a good coverage for the full year and some for the for growing season, but still we see almost a third of the studies, they only have a coverage for less than 3 months. So it's more like a very short campaign out there and doing the measurements. And those flux measurements are probably not very representative for the entire ecosystem across the year. And also at the same time, we look at the duration of those measurements. And most of the chamber measurement doesn't have a long-term commitment. So most of them just do it for 1 year and that's it. And I think this is also quite funding based. And some of the studies do 2 to 5 years, but there are rarely some studies doing more than 10 years. And the number of replicates are very important aspects as for chambers, because the coverage of the footprint is quite limited. The only thing to compensate the limited footprint areas to use more replicates. And the typical number used here is 3 to 5 replicates per study. I think this is quite reasonable, and only a few of them that use more than 10 replicates. And we can see these are very labor intensive campaigns out there. And also the frequency as a factor that controls how representative of the flux is measured for the seasonality. And we can see most of the studies have a sub-monthly measurements, which is quite manageable for most measurements. But there are still a few that are doing much even less than 2 months. So these are these studies, I don't know, it feels like they cannot produce reliable results to estimate the annual budget, because it doesn't capture the seasonal pattern over the years. And I think overall, what we find here is that there are still quite a lot of room for chamber measurements to improve in the future. And there's a need to standardize those chamber measurements to some point that they can be compared across studies in the future. And we also look at the studies based on different countries, and we see those peatland studies are very, very biased towards just a few of those countries. And we can see most of the few countries are with very good economy, so they have enough funding to do a lot of research on the peatland. And for a lot of the countries and down on this list, they can only carry out just a few of the studies. And we see that most of the studies are based on natural and disturbed ecosystems, but restored ecosystems are rarely studied in these countries. So the explanation is, we think it's because in those countries that the government doesn't really promote a lot of policy for restoration for peatland. That's why there are not so many studies that are covering restored peatland. And at the end of the study, we also calculate this observation gap index for different countries in order to in order to point out which countries they require more measurements. And this index is based on a number of studies and normalized by the peatland areas of those countries. And we see most of the Central and South African American countries and some of the African countries, and also in Asia, some of the Asian countries, they requires quite there's an urgent need for peatland research there. But at the same time, we also see that there are some countries, developed countries, that they don't really have a lot of peatland measurements. For example, in Australia, in this Tasmania island, they have a lot of peatland distributions there, but the study are relatively limited there. And in Europe, we can see where I am located now in Norway. We are also lacking quite a bit of research here in these regions. In summary, peatland greenhouse gas emissions have got more and more attention and get more studies now, which is a really good news. But at the same time, we can see this quality as a big issue here, and we need high quality and long-term greenhouse gas flux data in many regions. So in that case, adcurrence method is highly recommended. If not, those automatic chambers will be also a good option for measurements. And large observation gaps for Africa and Central South American countries that is shown on the map. And also at the same time, we need more restoration projects and to see different approaches for restoration across the different regions. So so we can see there's a big need for observations across many regions. And I just want to bring your attention back to Norway and introduce to you some of the examples here that we have been doing observations and what we can learn from those observations. And as probably some of you know that Norway is considered one of the countries with a big peatland coverage. And it is, according to most updated estimations, it's around 9% of the land. And but up to a quarter of those land has been drained. And so there's definitely a need for us to have more studies on drained peatland here. Sorry. So our site is located in the very north part of Norway, and it's in the Arctic Circle. And we have this one site with cultivated grass on the peatland. The site has been drained during 70s of last century and has been used as for agriculture since then. And at the site, we have some automatic chambers that's used to measure greenhouse gas emissions there. And here is the experiment design. We have 5 different plots at different locations. We find very nice gradients of water level, different water levels, and we have 2 fertilization treatments. And we use 30 automatic chambers measuring the fluxes there with a picaro that measures all the main greenhouse gases, CO2, CH4, and N2O. And we have a harvest in August. The experiment has been running since 2022. So here, I mean, the experiment is still running right now, but we have only some data from 2022. And so I would like to share some of the results we have so far. And this is the climate during 2022. at the site, we can see the air temperature is around 13 degree. And during the growing season, if we consider that is an Arctic site, and this is probably not considered a very cold site. And but I think most importantly is that the water levels were measured over the last season. We can see very good differences among the plots, and the biggest difference is up to 75 centimeters. If you consider that is only from one side, that is a very big difference. So we can use those wet plots as a simulation of a wetted scenario, and use those dry plots as what is a drained scenario. And when comparing those different plots, and of course our data looks a little bit messy, as all of us doing field measurements knows that we have to do a lot of cleaning up, and at the end we need to do a lot of gap filling because it has a lot of gaps. And after the gap filling, we calculated the budget, and the budget shows that very nice pattern here. And for the CO2 measurements, we see that in the dry side, it is a source of CO2, but when it comes to the wet side, it already becomes a sink for CO2. And for the methane flux is quite the opposite. So in the wet side, it is a source, but in the dry side, it's more like a neutral. And for N2O, as I mentioned, N2O emissions are very sporadic, so it's very hard to capture the patterns. So for our budget calculation here, what we can see is that in the high fertilization sites, there are definitely more hot moments, and compared to the low fertilization plots. And these are just the growing season measurements. And what we're very interested in is to combine all those greenhouse gases and calculate the balance of the ecosystem. So the way we usually do is to calculate the global warming potential, use different factors, different warming potential factors for methane and N2O, and standardize them into CO2 equivalent amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And at the end of the day, we see that this pattern is actually quite similar to what we see from the CO2 fluxes alone. So that means methane fluxes and N2O fluxes play a very, very minor role at our specific site, and the greenhouse gas balance is mainly dominated by CO2 fluxes here. But that's not the end of the story, and because it's a managed site, so we also have the biomass harvest. And if we count this biomass into as carbon that has been removed out of the ecosystem, that we will be able to see that this site will become a source of carbon no matter what kind of water levels are. And all of the plots will become a source of carbon. That means the carbon is still losing from the site, even though the CO2 balance for the west side is negative. That means some of them are sink for CO2, but the net carbon balance is still negative due to the harvest. And if we think of the harvest materials will be further decomposed after use, then they will be translated into CO2 emissions afterwards. And if we count this into the ecosystem budget for CO2 or the greenhouse gases, the greenhouse gas emission will be big. And if we think about a very extreme scenario that those grasses growing on the peatland are fed to the cow, and cows make a lot of CH4 emissions, and we calculate those into greenhouse gas balance there, and we see that the water management or water level effect doesn't really exist anymore, and it's so it's very important to consider the harvest. So this is my last slide, and I think the takeaways from here is that the CO2 emission is more important than CH4 and N2O emission. Because maybe that is because our specific site that is located in the relatively low up there. And according to our results, rewetting is a definitely necessary approach. It can largely reduce the emissions. And our study also demonstrated that agriculture is still possible after rewetting, even though the productivity could be reduced. But the most important thing is the harvest and how the harvest biomass are used will largely affect the net greenhouse gas balance, which is not usually accounted in many studies right now. And some solutions here and rewet. There are a lot of countries doing rewetting, and like the government, many countries in Europe, they really promote rewetting and send out incentives. I think that is one approach that we can tackle this drainage issue. But at the same time, the farmers, when they own the land, they also want to make use of the land and get benefits from that. Polluted culture could be a very promising way, but there's still a lot of ways to go to test the approach in different regions. And many farmers don't really trust the scientists. So we need to collaborate with the farmers to somehow establish some pilot sites for demonstration. So make them make this kind of beneficial results more trustworthy and visible. So I think that's all my presentations, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you. That was a very nice presentation, Junbin. Thank you very much for that. We have very little time left. I'm going to go through the questions rather quickly, but one thing I'd like to say before I start the questions, if people need to leave, that's very understandable. We can keep the maybe we can keep it open for a bit longer to answer questions, but if we can't, then remember that we're inviting anyone who's present and who has an interest in peatlands to join the peatland group of the GRA, but just to send an email to myself or to the GRA Secretariat, and we will be able to connect you and network with you and give you any more answers to questions you might have and help you to find the answers that you might need. So if I go quickly to the questions, the first question was from France, Zabaze Negetsi. Sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. I need more information about static chamber measurements to measure carbon flux. I think that's quite a general question. I wonder if that's something that we can answer also, because there's a lot of literature on the topic that we can point you to and give you and help you to get access to that would help you to answer that question. So maybe that's a question we take after the meeting if you'd like to get in touch. Elizabeth Beltran has also asked, apologies if I missed it, but what does high and low refer to in the charts?
Sorry, I should explain a little bit better. And the high means high fertilization dosage, and low means low. And usually this low is a dosage that is mostly used by the local farmers, and this high dosage is double that amount.
And we also have a question, and again, apologies if I make a bad attempt at your name. It's Melundu Miwila. I'm currently undertaking research to quantify greenhouse gases in smallholder agriculture in Zambia, Southern Africa, and would appreciate any insights on current trends.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is a question or more of a follow-up.
Yeah, I think it's a question. I mean, again, if you want to take contact with us, we could give you a more detailed answer to your question. Absolutely. Just a question to the Deborah, if you're there. I'm just wondering if we'd be able to put up some note about contact and contact details. Oh yes, you've actually had it here. So if you're interested in joining, it's in the chat, the secretariat at globalresearchalliance.org. And there's also a link to the website. And again, there was another question about the chamber method and what is the best recommendation for replication and duration. Again, I think the best thing that we can do there is to point you to the sources that are available. I think it's one of those questions that how long is a piece of string? Because I think it's really more to do it as a balance compromise between what you have the financing to do and then what you're able to actually do in the field. More is always better. There's another question. What about the accuracy of the eddy covariance compared to chamber?
Yeah, I think I can take that one. And the adequacy is measuring at the ecosystem level. And it has, as I said, it's based on the theory of micrometeorology. So there's a lot of prerequisites in order to do the measurements. So at the end of the measurements, there are usually a lot of data that doesn't fulfill those requirements, so they are removed out. So there are a lot of more gaps for EC measurements, but for the chamber measurement, and chamber measurement doesn't really account for all the fluxes coming out from the ecosystem. For example, the appellations, that episodic bubble coming out of the ecosystem, which is a big source of methane emission, those are not covered by chamber measurements because they are usually considered as outlier. But for eddy covariance, it is possible to cover those, capture those fluxes as well. So there's a big difference. But as to accuracy, I think both of them are accurate. It's just that depends on the focus of the study. And so you need to choose the method accordingly.
Thank you. We also have a question from Carla Stadler. Thank you, Junbin, for the presentation. Sorry if it's an obvious question, but how can re-wetting be done? Naturally by rainfall and by protecting peatlands from drainage? Question mark.
Yeah, the drainage, I mean, this is a very tricky question because there's a lot of discussions what is a proper rewetting and how it could be done. And I think for the site we're working on, there's the what we call rewetted site is actually just a block of the drainage. So it can, but the blocking of the drainage has a lot of effect because you cannot really control the water there. So there are a lot of discussions going on to make some active valves or some facilities to actively control the water inside the drainage. I think some of the content from Dr. Agus also covered some of the practices, like where to do the drainage, how much of the water level can change in the peatland itself. So yeah, I think this is a very big topic.
We also have a question from Kian Lee. If the chamber method compares with, so if the chamber compares with eddy covariance study include manual chamber and automatic chamber both. So if we, maybe the question is like, would we combine these methods together and whether the manual chamber method is appropriate in some conditions?
Yeah, I think this the best solution would be use both methods altogether, so you can have a better understanding of the entire system. But as I said, the footprint of the two methods, they are quite different. So even though you're measuring at the same ecosystem, the results could not be really comparable because they are basically not measuring the same thing.
I think it's also valuable to mention, especially considering these observation gaps, that it's very important that some measurements are taken. So the ideal is the ideal, but if a region's where there are no measurements, then a start is as good, regardless of whether you're using the manual chamber or automatic, or whether you have the financing to do the eddy covariance. So I think it's important. You know, we have an ideal, but it is an ideal.
Yeah, agree.
There was also another question: is paludiculture feasible in drained peatland in a tropical country that's been converted into agricultural area and is currently experiencing El Nino?
Yeah, this I don't think I can answer this. This has to be answered by some properly designed experiment. So, but culture is definitely something quite promising for many regions, and it's definitely worth to trying out in those countries as well.
I think the important thing there is that the crop has to have a market, and if the crop is replacing food production, for example, that maybe there'd be an issue that if you have to offset the food production to another region, that maybe you're just swapping emissions. But certainly, if there's a market for the product of paludiculture, this would be a very interesting thing to explore.
Yeah. I think for rewetting, the biggest advantage is to reduce the emissions, but for paludiculture, is more of for making economic benefits out from it.
Great. Well, I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining today, and thank you very much to the presenters for really excellent presentations. As we've noted in the chat, if anybody wants to get in touch with either the GRA or with the Peatland Group, we have some contact details in the chat that you should please try to note down now before the meeting ends. And then you can get in touch with us, and we'll be able to hopefully provide you with links to the information you need, or connections to people who might be able to help you find the answers, or even opportunities for networking for future research projects, and for people who might be able and willing to work on project proposals with you. And all I can say is thank you very much to the GRA for organising and setting this up, and I hope that everyone has a very good day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.